Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to this event. This is a book event for the Coddling of the American Mind by Greg Lukianoff and Jonathan Haidt. I'm delighted. I've been looking forward to this for a long time. I saw an early copy of this book, which I read with great interest, and I know many of you did too. Before I forget, there are copies for sale of this book right outside. Many of you know the authors that are here today. Greg Lukianoff is the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, or also known as FIRE, and John Haidt is the Thomas Cooley Professor of Ethical Leadership at New York University. I met Greg Lukianoff some years ago in an event. I met John Haidt 11 years ago, and the reason I met John was because of an event at the American Enterprise Institute. I had written a book as a visiting scholar here about happiness, and I put together a little book event. I was coming down from my professorship at Syracuse once every month or two, and they asked if I wanted to do a book event and who I'd like to include. And I was thinking about my favorite book on the topic. My book was on happiness. My favorite book was called The Happiness Hypothesis by this guy I'd never met, Jonathan Haidt, who at the time was a psychology professor at UVA. And I said, I wonder if I could get him. They said, you can get anybody at an event at AEI. You just call them up and say there's an event at AEI, and they come. And I said, fantastic. So I called up John Haidt, and sure enough, he showed up, and we got on like a house on fire. It turned out that John was had moved on from his happiness research and was doing something on a field I knew nothing about called moral foundations. And it was how liberals and conservatives see the world in a different way. The event at AEI came at a kind of a pivotal time in his own thinking. He might talk about that, he might not, but he says it was one of the first times that he had been in an environment that he thought of as really conservative, but he was treated with respect, which is what we pride ourselves on here at the American Enterprise Institute, because we have idea diversity, we have academic freedom, and we believe that everybody needs to be heard. And furthermore, even if we have a particular point of view, if we're wrong, we want to know first. And that's why everybody's welcome here. That's what this whole book is about, this new book that Greg and John have written, The Coddling of the American Mind. The idea that there are untruths in modern life, that people should trust their feelings, that people are fragile on American campuses, is something that has overtaken the United States in a very big way, and it's a really dangerous thing, according to this book. What is it about? How do we deal with it? You're going to find out. This book is in its third week in the New York Times bestseller list. It deserves to be there for a good long time. And with luck, it will change the conventional wisdom in this country and indeed save a good deal of the American university ecosystem. We have a panel that our host is going to introduce to you, and the host of this event is Jonathan RAUCH, a great friend of AEI, involved with AEI for a long time. Where's John? John is there. John is right here. He's going to introduce the rest of our panel, but I do want to say one thing about John. He works two doors down at the Brookings Institution, where he's been for a long time. We're sort of new neighbors because AEI is new in this building. As you know, we were around the corner, and when we needed a new place, I saw this site, and I said, you know what this street needs? A think tank. And so we moved in, next to Brookings, and we get closer access to our friends. John being, of course, one of them, who's done a great deal of work with us here at AEI. And I can't introduce John without mentioning his fantastic new book, which I actually blurbed, but that gave me an opportunity to read it really, really carefully. The Happiness Curve, Why Life Gets Better After 50. I found it a consoling book. And one that I highly recommend to your interest. So to introduce the panel and our special guests about the wonderful book, The Coddling of the American Mind, my friend Jonathan RAUCH.
Thank you, Arthur. Could everyone join me? A completely unexpected advertisement. So gracious of you, and you're always so gracious here at AEI to those of us at Brookings. The food is still better here. My name is Jonathan RAUCH. I'm a senior fellow at Brookings. I'm your moderator today because I wore a necktie. That's how these things work. We are next month on the 3rd anniversary of the famous Yale University Silliman College courtyard meltdown. Raise your hand if you've seen the video that went viral, video that was actually shot by one of the people on this panel. So an administrator was confronted by a group of angry students in a residential college. It's like a dorm courtyard. And in a video which went viral, one of the students shouts, and I quote, I'm afraid there's some blue language here, and I won't get the tone right. It is your job to create a place of comfort and home for the students that live in Silliman. Who the fuck hired you? You should step down. It is not about creating an intellectual space. It is not. Do you understand that? It's about creating a home here. You're disgusting. And so on. Something seems to have happened to lead many young people to expect safety and protection from what used to seem like everyday disagreement and interpersonal conflict. In their new book, The Coddling of the American Mind, John Haidt and Greg Lukianoff do a deep dive into some of the psychology behind what's going on here, the roots, the culture of safetyism, and they come up with what I think are some truly profound insights. You've already had John Haidt introduced. I also want to mention some things you may not know about him. He's also deeply concerned with polarization in our culture, and like me, is a board member of Better Angels, a national grassroots depolarization movement that gets divided communities talking to each other. He's a founder of the Heterodox Academy Project, which seeks to foster intellectual diversity on campus. Very important. Please check out their website. He also chaired an AEI Brookings working group on poverty reduction methods that might actually succeed. This is a man who does everything and does it well. Greg Lukianoff is an old friend of mine, and I do mean old. He's a father of 2 and the president of the Foundation for Individual Rights in Education, which is our country's leading defender of civil rights at universities. He's a lawyer by training. Don't hold it against him. He's also the author of several books, among them Unlearning Liberty, a very important book about free speech on campus. He's also a pseudonymous science fiction author, which I was not supposed to tell you. And the only things he loves more than zombies or lasers are zombies with lasers. ALLISON STANGER is a professor of international politics and economics at Middlebury College. She's written books on the Czechoslovak dissolution and the outsourcing of American power. She's working on books on leaks and on how the internet is remaking global security. Though she says she wants to look forward, not backward, in today's discussion, I think I should mention that it was she who was injured in the mob attack on Charles Murray last year at Middlebury, an inflection point in the national discussion about campus intolerance. And finally, our convener today, the person to whom we owe this gathering, my dear friend, Dr. Sally SATEL, a resident scholar here at AEI, a working psychiatrist who has treated addiction in inner city DC and testified frequently before Congress. Sally is the author of multiple books about the intersection of mental health and public policy. Her most recent book, co-authored with Scott Lilienfeld, is Brainwashed, the Seductive Appeal of Mindless Neuroscience. And she's one of the first people to have raised at least yellow flags about the ideological hijacking of medical concepts like trauma. Our run of show today is that Greg and John will present about their book, and then we'll have comments from Allison and Sally. Over to Greg.
Thank you so much. Thank you for telling everybody about my science fiction writing. I'm more of a particle beam man at this point than lasers, actually. So I'm going to tell the story of how we ended up doing the book. And it actually is a very personal story. I talk about it in a little bit in the book. Because in 2007, I was lucky enough to be admitted to a hospital with a life-threatening bout of depression. It was a life-changing experience for me, and I was, at that point, I'd been president of FIRE for 2 years, and being in the culture war all day long had a lot to do with it. Being kind of stuck in a situation where it was always presented as a good versus evil fight, among my friends, even in town, it kind of wears on you a little bit. But as I got my way out of depression, the thing that helped me was cognitive behavioral therapy. And for those of you, how many know about cognitive CBT here? Okay, most of you. So, so CBT essentially is a practice by which you talk back to your kind of exaggerated thoughts, and you do that partially by labeling them for what kind of cognitive distortion they are. And so, for example, a really common one is catastrophizing, thinking that things are going to go terribly. I'm very big on binary thinking, where essentially like either everything's going to be fantastic or I'm completely freaking doomed. There's no in between. And I don't mean to do that, but my wife points out I do this all the time. There's also labeling and overgeneralization. They're all cognitive distortions. And I was studying all these things to sort of talk back to your own kind of anxious thoughts in your head. And, and to a degree, everybody does cognitive distortions. But people who are anxious and depressed do a lot more of them. They do them kind of pathologically, and they grow in number as you get more and more depressed. But amazingly, just getting the habit, and it's really important to emphasize, it's not just cognitively knowing this stuff. It's getting into the habit of talking back to your kind of more exaggerated, more fearful, more catastrophizing thoughts is a very effective treatment for anxiety and depression. I have never fallen into a depression like I did in 2007, and I never even come close to it, partially because I developed these habits. Now, back to campus. During that time, of course, while I was studying this, I was working on campuses, and I was noticing that administrators were passing policies that had rationales that were all rooted in catastrophizing, labeling, binary thinking, all of this kind of really exaggerated sense of threat and mind reading, thinking that people actually secretly hate you or have contempt for you. All of these ideas, they seemed to, the administrators kind of took for granted that there was somehow something healthy about permeating this exaggerated sense of threat on campus. And at the time, I thought, well, it's terrible that administrators are doing this, but thank goodness students aren't paying attention. Students actually, up until around 2013, 2014, were absolutely the best constituency for free speech on campus. They seemed to not really buy what the administrators were selling, and that was great. And I devoted my career to defending the free speech rights of faculty and professors. But sometime around 2013, 2014, we noticed at FIRE that suddenly we were disagreeing with students, that they were demanding microaggression policies, for example, or trigger warning policies at different schools, demanding that speakers not speak on campus, not just commencement, just coming to a talk. They're saying, if that person is here, that would actually cause me trauma. That would cause me medically definable psychological harm. Now, I knew enough from sort of being a psychology hobbyist and also having benefited from CBT myself that grounding this in the language of psychological harm, I was like, that's exactly the opposite of what a psychiatrist would tell you or a psychologist would tell you. They wouldn't say, if you're afraid of this thing, by all means, let's get rid of it and make sure that you never see it, because that could actually really validate your aversion to something, which can make it feel more like a phobia and eventually turn it into something more like a schema. It seemed the exact opposite of what you'd actually want to teach a generation of people, yet they were using it as a justification for censorship. Thankfully, at that point, for about a year, I'd become friends with John. We had lunch one at a time. The second time, we sat down for lunch at an Indian restaurant in Greenwich Village, and I talked about just the idea of how what we were teaching a generation of students seemed to be completely at odds with cognitive behavioral therapy. This led to the article that we would then write, and then eventually to the book when we realized things had gotten so much worse.
Okay. So I just want to start by thanking AEI and Arthur for bringing us here and for creating this kind of space that values intellectual diversity. Arthur's right. The first time I came down here in around 2007 or whenever it was, we had our happiness books. I really was a little nervous, like it's going to be full of conservatives, and conservatives are these evil people who are going to be, bad people or something like that. But it's like people were very nice to me, and as I've gotten to know AEI and been here a number of times, there's what struck me is that at events like this, there's vastly more ideological diversity than at any event I've ever been to organized at a university. As the university climate has gotten stranger and more orthodox, I think AEI has gotten even more committed to viewpoint diversity. So thank you to Arthur and to all the fellows and scholars here at AEI. To pick up Greg's story here, Greg came to me with this idea at our lunch in 2014, and it just made perfect sense of some strange things that I had begun seeing at NYU and just reading about what else was going on. So I volunteered to work with Greg and turn this into an article, and we did. We published it in August of 2015. And then after that, all hell broke loose, beginning at Yale Halloween and then spreading all the way through the violence at Middlebury and Berkeley and Claremont McKenna. Even though every investment decision I've ever made, if I just did the opposite, I'd be richer today. When it comes to intellectual investments, putting our money in this topic has been the greatest growth stock of our intellectual environment.
Unfortunately, business has been booming.
Been booming, that's right. So I thought what I'd do with my few minutes here is this. I assume that very few of you have read the book, that many of you are intending to read the book now, but that you'll be swamped by other things to read and other things to do in the coming months, and that most of you won't read the book. So what I thought I would do is
But they'll all buy the book.
That's all I really care about. No. No. So I thought what I would do is just make a couple remarks about why you should care. What is really important in this book? And I don't know anything about you as an audience, so you're very varied by age, certainly. So I'll just make a few things that I think make this book speak to a lot of different audiences. Here's some reasons why you should care, while at the same time, I hope I will make you shake your head with horror and arouse some negative emotions in you that will frighten you into wanting to read the book. So here we go. 3 reasons why you should care. The first is that most of you either are parents or you are young adults. And this is a book not just about college campus. A lot of it is about child rearing. And so I'll start off with the most shocking figures in the book, which are that we have a number of graphs in Chapter 7 that go into the mental health crisis. Now, we're careful about, we don't want to foment moral panics. It's very easy these days to start a moral panic. But if you see the graphs in Chapter 7, you see the way that depression has been shooting upward since around 2011, 2012. 2010 to 2012, it begins arcing upward, especially for young women. Anxiety has gone up even faster. We don't have a graph of that, but the reports are that it is now the most common reason why college students go to the counseling center. It used to be relationships, depression, and anxiety are all 3 equal, roughly. Now anxiety overwhelms the others. This is not just self-report. This is not just that the young generation is comfortable with the language of mental illness, because the hospital admissions data for self-harm, for cutting their bodies, shows the same patterns, especially for teenage girls. The suicide rate, if you compare the first 10 years of this century, about 2001 to 2010, it was fairly stable for both teenage boys and girls. If you look at the boys' rate the last 2 years, it has gone up 25%. The suicide rate for teenage American boys is up 25%. For girls, it's up 70%. 7-0. This is a crisis. This is very, very serious. And this is why when we speak about this, we find people everybody who's a parent has seen this if they have teenage kids, either in their own kids or in their kids' friends. So this is a crisis. This is something we all have to be aware of and start working on. Now, why did this happen? There are a lot of, and we go into this in the book, and this I hope you'll find interesting. A big part of the story is social media, but we've been talking about social media everybody's sick of hearing about social media. We've all been talking about it for the last several years. The other really big piece of it is overprotection. That's what coddling means, is overprotection. And so here's something I'm discovering as I've been speaking about the book. I'll try it with you. There's a period of child development from roughly 8 to 12 when human children slow down their growth. Other species don't. They just grow and grow and grow till they reach sexual maturity and then they reproduce. Humans have this weird pattern. We grow to about age 7 or 8, and then we slow down. We're still growing, but slower. And then we have a burst around 12 or 13. And it's thought that this is a unique period in human development for culture learning, because it's at that age, around 8, that kids go out of the home. They have adventures. They're very interested in different occupations and watching people working. This is when children's stories all take place. They leave home. And so this is a period of apprenticeship for cultural learning, is what many anthropologists think. This is when street kids start all over the world. At age 8, you see kids living out on the street. They can steal food and run from the police, and they can survive at age 8. So what have we done with that age from 8 to 12? Well, let's find out. My question for you is, at what age were you let out? But what I mean by that is, at what age were you allowed to walk 6 blocks to a store to buy something? Or at what age were you allowed to walk over to a friend's house and then you hang out, or you go down to a park, or you do something? Think about the age at which your parents let you out, so that there was no supervision. You were supervising yourself. So if it was first grade, that's about age 6. If it was 5th grade, that's about age 10. Okay, so think of the number for you. At what age were you let out? Now, just people who are 40 years old and older. If you're 40 and older, okay, call it out. Just call out your number. What's your number? That's what I always hear. 5, 6, and 7. That's what it always used to be. 5, 6, and 7. That's the normal human pattern for development. You're let out, you have experiences, you learn that the world is a place that you can deal with. You can do things on your own. You don't need anyone to protect you. Okay? Now, people under 25, raise your hand if you're under 25. How many do we have here? Okay, we have a fair number. Oh, wow. Yeah. Okay, just you people under 25, call out your number. 18? 17? Okay, yeah. So now here, I heard a couple of 8s and 9s. Normally, when I do this on a college campus, it's 12 to 14. And I hear a couple of 10s. I've never yet heard a number under 10. Oh, wait. One young woman, she said 6. And I looked at her. I said, really, 6? And she said, well, that was the Philippines. Then we moved here, and it was 12. So, okay. But you heard it was a range. There were a couple 8s and 9s, but mostly it was 10 to 15. So what we've done, and it might be that AEI selects for people who actually were let out when they were kids before the age of 14. But what I'm finding, by and large, is we are overprotecting our kids in the crucial period, and they don't learn that the world is safe and controllable, and then they go off to college, and guess what? They do all the stuff that Greg was noticing. That a book is coming to campus, it's dangerous. A speaker is coming to campus, it's dangerous. So the child rearing, this is one of the biggest things that I think will appeal to a broad audience. The second point that many of you will be interested in is employment. When Greg and I published our article in 2015, people said, oh my God, all this crazy stuff. They'll grow out of it. As soon as they enter the real world, when they leave a college campus, they're not going to do this stuff anymore. Well, no. Here's one of our Amazon reviews we just got the other day. A guy writes, 5 stars. I couldn't understand why my new bright young workers kept running to HR for every little interpersonal problem, and why they refused to show up to meetings with the person who they thought offended them. This book explains a lot about those recent bad hires. And I'm hearing this from all kinds of people. If they've hired people who graduated from college in the last few years, suddenly these people are just running to HR, they're thin-skinned, they're objecting to all sorts of things, and it makes it very hard to get your work done. So if you hire people, you need to know about this. I'm not saying don't hire people born after 1995. I'm saying you have to be careful who you hire and look for signs that they actually can handle themselves without their parents. And secondly, you have to really set clear norms, and you have to help them realize that, you know what, the world is really different from college. And then the last thing, which I'll just very briefly mention, is the problems of democracy. Here we are in Washington. Many of you are interested in policy. And play and childhood experience teaches us the skills of getting along with others without having to call in reinforcements and punishment. Now, obviously, people in Washington here are doing a very bad job of that. But when Gen Z, when the young generation, when they rise to the age of political activity, when they're running things, the prediction is that things are going to get vastly worse than they are today. So, on that happy note, I turn it over to the rest of our panel.
Before we get to Allison, if I could use my prerogative to invite the two of you, if you're interested, to say a few words about the 3 great untruths, which go to the heart of the substance of the book.
Sure, absolutely.
Okay, well, I'll do the first of the. Yeah, we do it in a standard order.
Yep.
So my first book is called The Happiness Hypothesis. It's about 10 ancient ideas and the psychology behind them. And if university campuses people read these 10 ancient ideas and did the opposite of all of them, that's where we are. That's where we would be, and we are there. So one of them is what doesn't kill you makes you stronger, is the axiom. But what we're finding is that on campus, many people have somehow come to believe that what doesn't kill you makes you weaker. So if you're exposed to hate speech, which is very broadly construed to mean something that I hate. So if you're exposed to speech that you hate, this will damage you. And this is, of course, the opposite, we think, of the psychology. For when we were writing the book, I feel like there were times we got kind of deep into sort of a research hole, particularly around some of the intersectionality and some of the more theoretical stuff. And when we were talking about kind of what we were ultimately trying to say in the original article, it was more or less, it was as if we had given the worst possible advice to a generation of people, as if it was sincere advice. And the second one is the one closest to my heart, but it's the one that sounds the most persuasive, which is your feelings are always right. Sounds nice, sounds romantic, and it's just dead wrong.
No, that's not something you're going to find a wisdom tradition that believes that. You're not going to find modern psychology that says that. Now, I do believe that your feelings always are always information. But a lot of times, part of becoming an adult is learning that when you feel jealous or that flash of anger or that moment of hostility, it's actually telling you something much more different, much different from what your body actually wants it to mean. And so we call this the great untruth of emotional reasoning. Emotional reasoning is actually a cognitive distortion. It's one of the ones I didn't mention when I was opening up, where essentially in cognitive behavioral therapy, you're supposed to actually talk back that you shouldn't shut up just because I'm angry. That's not the kind of world we can live in. But increasingly on campuses, even though this was kind of a stereotype of the way campuses were when I started working on campus in 2001, I was very rarely seeing students say, this makes me feel angry, this makes me feel uncomfortable. Sometimes they say unsafe, but largely it means uncomfortable. And that's why you can't speak here, because it's not a particularly persuasive argument, but it somehow became a legitimate argument in 2013, 2014. And I've seen a lot more of people making assertions of emotional states rather than, the fact that someone is offended, noted. That's an emotional state. It's not actually an argument in and of itself.
And then the third great untruth is life is a battle between good people and evil people. My second book is called The Righteous Mind, Why Good People Are Divided by Politics and Religion. And it's about how we evolved to be tribal creatures who are really, really good at doing us versus them. And so if you're trying to build a college community that is diverse, we're all trying to increase diversity, a really, really good thing would be to turn down the tribalism. But instead, in many ways, we turn it up. We try to make people more conscious of their identities, and in some cases, we teach people to judge members of other groups as being bad. The evaluations of various dimensions of identity are not just descriptive, they're moral dimensions of good and bad. And so in a lot of ways, again, it's like I wrote 2 books, and on college campuses we're doing the exact opposite of everything I've ever recommended. So I guess I've got a perfect batting record, and things are going to get a lot worse because they're going to ignore this book too. We'll see.
Yeah, and it's interesting. All of these also still relate back to cognitive distortion. So this one is very much the binary thinking.
That's right.
And one of the reasons why I'm such a fan of John's work, and I was so thrilled that I got to write with him, was because I'm very concerned about polarization. And we were noticing this, particularly when you're working in the culture wars. There's this kind of what I've talked about. We should actually give a hand. Pamela Paretsky is the my chief researcher, and she ended up being the chief researcher for the book. Would you give her a hand? And she talks a lot about, and John does as well, about moral pollution, about the idea that even being close to that dissenter, that person who wrote that awful book that makes arguments you've been told are forbidden, being in the same room with them is somehow evil. And it has this deep religious kind of, superstitious kind of feel to it. And I've seen this just get worse on campus. Almost, it seemed to, somehow 9/11 actually seemed to give campuses a moment of, wow, I can get in trouble for what I say too, to professors and to students. But then since then, it's been watching this sort of polarization spiral away, both on campus and off. I thought it was pretty bad in 2012, but now it's insane.
Let's put a couple other thoughts on the table before we get to our panelists. Do you guys have a theory as to why a generation which was raised so differently is raising their kids this way? Mm-hmm. Why that change happened? And do you guys have an idea of how you go about changing that culture?
Yeah. Well, for one thing, it seems as though every decision that a woman makes about how to raise her kids is one that she will take flack for. There's an incredible moralization of parenting. And we're very, very responsive to social pressures. In fact, one of the interesting findings about heritability is our personalities are shaped largely by our genes. But to the extent that other influences come in, it's not from our parents. It's actually from our peers. We're very sensitive to what our peers are doing, not so much our parents. And so there was a big change in the 1990s in how we raise kids. In part, we were drowned in stories about very few kids get abducted in this country by strangers. It's almost always the non-custodial parent. But the few cases of actual abductions are put in our faces so that it was in the 90s, just as the crime wave was ending, just as this gigantic crime wave was ending and crime rates were plummeting, we got the idea that if you ever have your kids outside unsupervised, they will be snatched. And I don't know when we get the first reports of parents being arrested for letting their kids play outside. I don't know of any before the early 2000s. So I don't know if that began in the 90s or if that was only around 2005, 2006. But by 2008, 9, 10, there's a general norm, especially in suburban and urban areas. It may be less so in rural areas, that the world is so dangerous. Child molesters and abductors are everywhere. And so these are some of the reasons why we changed.
Sorry. And there are two reasons that I think made for such a quick change. And one thing that, in the course of researching the parenting chapters, which were actually, for us, I think probably two of the most fun chapters to write, we got to interview a lot of experts, and really, that was kind of a learning experience for us. But when you line up when people, who have kids who are my age or John's age or any of our age, it was pretty much a safe bet to assume that that every year things were going to be more, the murder rate was going to go up almost every year, as it did pretty much from almost 1960 up. And
68 or so, yeah.
And I assumed, I really did assume as a kid, that by the time we're looking at 2000, that it was just going to be a complete, Mad Max wasteland. So there is, and I wrote science fiction to this effect, but all of us kind of believed it because none of us had ever lived in a situation in which the crime rate was going down.
Yeah.
So that's the rational part of it. So it makes me somewhat more forgiving of parents who are living in possibly the most safe time in human history, raising their kids as if they're in the most dangerous time. But the other one that I have a lot of sympathy for is that as you have sort of like the hollowing out of the middle class, the sense that you have to get to the life raft of Princeton and Stanford and some of these fancier colleges, it does increase kind of the idea that, oh my God, the best thing I can do for my kid is aim him like a rocket, like a heat-seeking missile towards these fancy colleges. And that requires basically ruining their lives, scheduling them from 6 a.m. to 10 a.m., on this belief that will actually keep them safe from the much more sort of cutthroat sort of environment we see today. So I do think part of it, and we do focus, we are very clear in the book, we're talking about the kind of parents who send their kids to the more elite colleges.
No, but middle class too. It's not just upper middle class. The research on parenting shows that there's a big split between middle class and working class.
Yep.
But we're not talking about the top 10%. This is more like top 50%, top 60%.
Okay.
Allison.
Yeah, well, there's so much that you've thrown out here, and the book is great. I'd encourage you all to read it. But let me just pick up on something you just said that interests me, and I might want to toss this back to you as a question. I'm wondering whether some of the tribalism that we're seeing on college campuses, the identity politics, is in some way linked to elite college admissions. Because remember, we're seeing more of it, you point out more of it on the coast. We've got some young people out here, maybe you'd want to comment on this as well. If you are being told that the way to get into the top institutions at this country is to be the perfectly polished little tile in that identity mosaic that particular school needs, that's going to teach you, if you get in, that the reason you're special is you're that particular identity. Whether it's a saxophone player or a lacrosse player or whatever you want it to be. And that's uniquely harmful, I would think, to higher education, precisely because the idea of education is to kind of shake you up and make you re-examine your identity. You may come out in the same place and believe the same things you believed when you came in. You may not. But the process of questioning and being challenged and feeling a little unsettled is very much a part of education. And you write about this as well. So I think that's a really interesting thing that we could perhaps discuss, the connection between admissions and this tribalism.
Well, I think you need to, in any social group, you need to look at how people get prestige. And so if emphasizing your identity is how you get prestige, well, then you'll do it. And so in some environments, that might be something that you do more. If emphasizing victimhood is how you get prestige, then you'll do that more. I think the key reason to understand why, so we made, at Heterodox Academy, we made a graph of where the actual shoutdowns have occurred, because there haven't been that many shoutdowns. There are only a few cases of violence, thank God. They're almost all in the Northeast, especially New England, but then down into New York, and one or two in the Washington area. But they're almost all in the Northeast, and then the coastal strip of the West Coast. So there's this guy, Colin Woodard, he talked about the 11 nations of America, and they're almost all in Yankeedom and the left coast. The other 9 areas don't have much going on in terms of like violence and shoutdowns. Those are also the areas that are most politically homogeneous. And so as America, one of the big threads, one of the big causes is left and right. When I was in college in the 80s, we all hated Ronald Reagan and all that, but like the left-right culture war was not nearly so strong. There was much more ability to work together across the aisle in Congress. It's really in the 90s, steadily up to the present, that cross-partisan animosity has risen. So if you're going to a university in which almost everybody is on the left, and it could theoretically happen on the right, but it's happening on the left, in places where almost everyone's on the left, certainly all the faculty are on the left, at a time when left and right hate each other more and more, that, I think, is part of the conditions for the explosion that happened to you and Charles, for example.
Yeah, I sort of inadvertently turned myself into the moderator. I didn't mean to do that, John. But so let me
I'll give you the necktie if it helps.
Yeah, please. That would be nice. Let me just say a little bit about that, because I think the Middlebury experience is definitely living, breathing proof that which does not kill us does make us stronger. Okay. It does make us stronger. So let me say a little bit about what I've learned from that experience, because I think that might add something to our discussion. And basically, strangely enough, just to refresh your memories.
Everyone,
you might not know.
You're about to explain, okay.
You explain. You're the moderator, and you've got the necktie.
I just wanted to make sure everyone, raise your hand if you're unaware of what happened at Middlebury College in, I think, April of last year when Charles Murray came to campus.
See, they're already forgetting.
No, some are unfamiliar.
I think you should
Those
explain.
are unfamiliar,
Yeah.
I think you should explain.
Yeah, basically, I made the fatal mistake of agreeing to moderate a panel, moderate Charles Murray's appearance at Middlebury College. Some students who are members of the American Enterprise Club invited him to campus. They thought he might be controversial, so they asked me, a liberal, to ask the first 4 questions, not just moderate, but to really grill him. And I prepared and read everything and had the killer questions, and the most unexpected thing happened to me, which is that the students assembled shut the event down. We went to a remote location where we webcast it. We continued with fire alarms going off and people trying to climb through the window, and then in trying to leave the building, students and the Antifa, who had been invited in, swarmed the vehicle. It was like a scene from Homeland. They were rocking it. I thought they were going to break through the windows, and I wound up with a concussion and whiplash. I was injured.
And you were physically seized at one point, right?
Well, what happened is this: we were sort of being swarmed by this mob, and they were really going for Charles Murray, and I was just in their way, and he looked like he was going to fall, so I took his arm, which is what would be a human thing you do, right? If a 74-year-old man looks like he's going to fall, you take his arm. And that's what enraged someone. So someone pulled my hair from one direction and body slammed me the other way, and that's how I wound up really quite shaken up. So what did I learn from this? Well, first of all, I was never anticipating this. I had no idea that I was on a college campus where something like this could happen. A bunch of factors went into that. And we could discuss this at length, but the thing I would like to point out that relates to your book is that it was an emotional response. And it was crowd behavior, mob behavior. People came there and did things that they didn't intend to do because other people were doing them. There's a whole host of things going on. But the main thing I want to draw out here is that students were mad about some very real issues. I mean, there is great emotion about what's happening in this country, about promises undelivered, racial injustice, all the things we can talk about. Those emotions were real. And they kind of exploded. And the tragedy is that it brought about the exact opposite of what they were trying to accomplish. So to me, that's a teaching moment in that what you learn from that is very much what comes out of your book and what you've spoken about with...
That your feelings aren't always right.
Well, that your feelings led you to do something that hurt a professor who'd been there 25 years, and that brought all kinds of horrible, negative publicity to this institution that's educating you.
Yeah.
And to the causes they were fighting for.
And the cause they were fighting for.
And having talked to students both involved in Middlebury and certainly involved at Yale, this is the way it is always explained to me, is that they're angry about very legitimate things. And I'm always like, yes, absolutely, I agree with you on practically all of these topics, but what does this have to do with ALLISON STANGER? Mm-hmm. What does this have to do with the person who became the target of it? And that was something that seemed to be a major disconnect, that even though you were focusing on these larger causes, as we talk at length in the book, why did you get poor Dean Spellman fired when she was trying to be nice, trying to send a nice
Claremont
McKenna
College.
Yeah, so there's just a lot of unintended consequences. I think what I would say, we're living in these very polarized times, and people get very emotional. This is just not just in the university, but in the larger world beyond, particularly here in Washington, D.C. And somehow I wish there was a way. I think the key is we've got to find a way together to validate those emotions, say they're legitimate, and use that as a foundation for having a meaningful discussion. I would call it empathetic listening. And as I've looked at just recently with the discussions I put in quotation mark, that we're having about the Kavanaugh hearings, I see that very much at work, that people just aren't listening to one another, and there's a lot of emotion involved. And I think part of education should be helping to teach students how to acknowledge emotion, accept it, but then realize that emotion isn't going to get us where we need to go. And I'll just conclude with something about the classroom, and I think this is something for all of us here as well. We can all model the behavior we want to see. The thing that concerns me, if it's not taking place in college classrooms, it's not going to take place with the larger public. So I described what happened to you. This is I've never had anything like this in my classroom at all, because I lay out the ground rules from the beginning. That we're going to have open-ended discussions. You are going to speak freely. You're going to speak your mind. Because if students are self-censoring, we're not going to learn. We're not going to grow. But we're all humans. We're coming from all different backgrounds. We're diverse. We're probably going to wind up offending each other at some point. Well, what do you do when you offend another human? You apologize, and then you move on. If you don't understand why you've offended another human being, that's obviously a teachable moment too. I find that if we teach students that this is not about ad hominem attacks, education is not about ad hominem attacks, we are going to focus on arguments, and you can stop that in the classroom immediately if there's an ad hominem attack. No. I want to hear an argument. I don't want you to attack the character of that person. Let's back up. Let's examine the premises. Let's look at the chain of logical reasoning. And then if you do that, if you set the ground rules, you can have those kind of conversations you want to have. And hopefully, this is the hope, that can ripple outward into the broader public. And books like yours can help us get there.
You've been teaching 25 years or so? Is that right?
Yeah.
So what's your sense about the story that John and Greg are telling, that there's kind of this new culture of safetyism? Have you seen that reflected at Middlebury or in your teaching career?
You know, it's interesting because I described you my classroom, and I was oblivious to a lot of these trends going on at large because I control my classroom, and what happens there is a beautiful thing, both for me and for my students. I'd like to think. But the experience I went through did make me aware of larger trends that have been going on for some time, and you write well about their sources. They're better people, I think, to speak on that.
Sally?
So I was let out at 6, and I spent my childhood running to get my father's cigarettes. I remember that. So I think one of the more powerful parts of your causal story is the raising of children, and you cover that beautifully and fortunately. And one reason I think, as you told us earlier, that's one of the most sort of popular parts of the book, at least is because it's one that lends itself to some sort of real, palpable solutions that you enumerate. But, when you said, Greg, that they're doing exactly what a therapist shouldn't do, well, they're doing exactly what a cognitive behavioral therapist, would not do. But unfortunately, they're not doing what they are doing what a lot of therapists do. Uh-huh. And so one of my questions is, and I'm going to give examples, so I'll ask the question and I'll come back to it, but is what I've seen going on in some therapeutic circles just parallel to the dynamics you observe, or is it somehow feeding it? And I'm referring to, probably the most formative time in my career as a psychiatrist was working at a VA hospital. That's obviously the cue to talk about trauma. And stipulate war trauma, horrific, real, post-traumatic stress disorder, certainly a legitimate diagnosis. But the VA did some things at the time, and granted this was Vietnam era, and they did learn some lessons. But they did almost everything wrong, which is to say that there was a very big emphasis on collecting disability for your problem. Now, of course, if you're impaired and there's no obvious resolution in sight, or even if one may come about, but there's a long period of invalidism, of course you need to be supported, and you made this amazing sacrifice for your country, so no question about that. But the lowest threshold imaginable to consider somebody permanently, or at least, if not permanently, then for a long period of time, basically incapable of entering the workforce and functioning productively in society. So there was a very low threshold for considering this a chronic problem, for getting on for basically entering an institution of disability where, as you know, the cycle is almost always one of spiraling invalidism downward, because the power of suggestion is so powerful, it is so strong, especially when someone is fragile and they're told they're not going to recover. The script was that whatever happened to you after a trauma, in this case, after a war experience, and I should say most of our patients weren't actually in combat. In the Vietnam War, about 15% actually were in combat. And then there was a penumbra of soldiers who were in dangerous occupations, like driving a truck. It would be very dangerous, even if you weren't an infantryman. So that would count as well. But the basic script was that was point A. Basically, your life in a way, your life started then. Your whole childhood had collapsed into it. So whatever preceded it was irrelevant, because this was the defining event of your life, and whatever followed from it was due to that event. Now, sometimes it was, there's no question, but there was an assumption that it was, that experience ruined your life. These are unhealthy conclusions to jump to. They might be true in some cases, but they deserve a lot more exploration with patients, and that often wasn't forthcoming. And then we saw another development. I'll fast forward to, I'll also mention, I think one of the reasons I got very disillusioned with inpatient psychiatry was, now you only stay 6 minutes, but in the old days, you could stay, several weeks. And there was enormous infantilizing going on of patients. So that, I thought, was not helpful to them. Then there was, and it still exists to my amazement, I wrote about this back in 2000 at the University of San Francisco, University of California at San Francisco, and their psychiatric units were divided up into identity group. So there was the black inpatient psych ward. There was the Asian inpatient psych ward. There was I don't think whites had one, but there was a gay, lesbian. We didn't have they weren't the other initials back then. And this was part of a larger kind of therapeutic movement, which was called multicultural therapy, which was still very much, in fact, Columbia, Derail Wing Sue is still promoting this, and it's still very much an ongoing kind of therapy. And basically the idea is, instead of a trauma, whatever your current problems are, you can trace them back to the fact that you've been oppressed in some way. And then finally, I'll mention, I don't know if Christina Summers is still here, but we wrote about a number of these examples in our a book we wrote called One Nation Under Therapy. And this was about 9/11 and how the Psychiatrists of America and other therapists had thought that after 9/11, clearly a vast trauma to international psyche, and for those people in the environs, a physical trauma as well. So many people dead, living in New York where you could, and around here, no question. But there was such an anticipation, a certainty that there would be psychic fallout all over the country. Billions of dollars were spent on therapy. In fact, the funding just stopped a few years ago. It exceeded the 10-year anniversary of money coming from HHS to treat the undoubtedly traumatized, and I say that in a clinical sense. Who wasn't traumatized? Of course you were. That was the healthy psychic reaction. But again, the expectation, and that, in fact, we'd always describe our book as, it's about the presumption of fragility. It was about adults. In fact, Christine had written we divided the book up, and her first chapters were about the cotton wooling of children, and how even red pens were somehow traumatic to use. But anyway, so there is sadly, in a sense, the culture comes by this honestly if they somehow look to the profession that is supposed to help patients navigate these kinds of experiences, but in a constructive way, and we don't always do that.
And I'm glad you said the name of the book, because I was going to, if you didn't say it yourself, I was going to refer everybody to the book One Nation Under Therapy, which I've read a couple times, and I think it's really excellent. You and Christina, along with people like Wendy Kaminer, actually point out a lot of how therapeutic culture, particularly, Wendy likes to pick on Oprah, for example, which is always a dangerous person to pick on, but for creating sort of a self-fulfilling prophecy of sort of woundedness and fragility. And I think there's a lot of truth to it. And I think it's one of the reasons why I do get, when we both get some pushback to talking about cognitive behavioral therapy, which always leads me to say, well, get over the T a little bit. Because really, if you look at what cognitive distortions are, they're good habits of mind for arguing with yourself, and amazingly, they actually help you deal with anxiety and depression. But they're also really good habits for how you argue with each other. Like if we lived in a society where we said, don't overgeneralize, don't label, don't catastrophize, and we asked ourselves, am I doing this while arguing, we would have wonderfully more productive arguments. So we actually, and that's one of the reasons why we also link it back to Stoic thought, because we do both actually think that, because I used to study Buddhism and we're both very interested in Stoicism, that the parallels are really there. So I understand why people are concerned about sort of some of the therapeutic models, because I think you're right, that the therapeutic model, to some degree, a bad version of it, is what got us here in the first place. But I do think that there's an argument to be made that at least some of the therapy that has good parallels all throughout human history, like the Stoicism connection to CBT, could actually help get us out of it.
And the VA, I have to give it credit, really has tried to steer people away from. They kept patients in for a long time, and sometimes they recreate the platoon, literally, and it was a very regressive environment. Wow. And they've stopped that unless someone just clearly needs inpatient. They've also
that gets the question I was about to ask you and John, which is a path back. What kind of openness, if any, is there in A, the psychiatric profession, and B, the psychological academy, to the story you're both telling, which is the anti-fragile story?
Well, actually, I can start on that because so Greg and I had an article in the New York Times on the importance of play, and we go through the research that's in Chapter 8 on how incredibly important play is for finishing the wiring of the brain. And literally the day we submitted the draft to the editors at the New York Times, like 10 minutes after we submitted it, the American Academy of Pediatrics came out with a report advocating vastly more play, that American kids need play. Now, they kind of did this weird thing where they kept talking about play supervised by adults, which misses half the point. But they were saying, but they did get that we in our misplaced idea that if kids are exposed to Mozart early, they somehow will be smarter. Completely not true. But we thought that in the 90s. And so we had the idea that, well, if we take fractions and move them from second grade down to kindergarten, they'll be smarter. I mean, completely not true. But in pushing academics down to younger and younger grades, we keep pushing out play. And the American Academy of Pediatrics published a major report just saying this was a mistake. No, kids need to play a lot more than they're doing. So I think the developmental psychologists are understanding that we're messing kids up, we're overprotecting them. So there, I think, but I don't know about clinical.
So that aircraft carrier is turning. What about clinical psychiatric care?
Well, unfortunately, in a way, it was by necessity because of funding and because of shortened inpatient stays and even outpatient. There is a bit of a push to be a little more pragmatic. And so I think there is more of an emphasis, frankly, on cognitive and behavioral. And certainly in addiction, which is now really big because of the opioid crisis, it really clarified a lot of, I think, a fair amount of thinking on that, besides the medications that can stabilize people, an effort to be very, very pragmatic. This is not a time to talk about your childhood traumas simply because it's not a time to do anything that's distressing because your typical response to being distressed is to use drugs. So you stay away from those topics early on in the trajectory of that kind of therapy. What actually came into my mind, and maybe glances off your question, but is the fact that in the context of the American Psychiatric Association, it's doubling down on not being able to, on telling its members that it should not make comments about the mental health of public figures. Because, as you know, there's been a lot of discussion of...
Really, who?
Right, yeah. So now part of that may have been a little cynical. They just don't want to, be accused of being wrapped up in the whole politicization of our field. But there is a real danger, I think, that psychiatry and psychology, can get highly politicized when
definitely.
it makes comments about, high-profile political figures, and they were really, they even up the ante. It's not that you just, the Goldwater rule, I'm sure most folks are familiar with that. It's not that you simply shouldn't diagnose from afar a public figure without his permission. You shouldn't say anything. And that's a whole different debate, I suppose. But the fact that they at least wanted to strike a blow for a real, firewall, hopefully, between, politics and psychiatric scholarship. I mean, we can talk about, there are all kinds of neutral ways to talk about narcissism and sociopathy without mentioning certain people.
I'm going to bodily move us away from that topic.
Okay. Making you nervous. You look a little nervous.
Yeah, it's venturing toward the T word, which we're not going to use here today, and I don't mean triggers.
You don't mean therapy, okay.
Or therapy.
Yeah.
But so in terms of the psychiatric, there's a long-standing criticism that psychiatry fosters weakness and codependency because it's good for business. True, false, or moving away from it?
Well, there's not enough, again, honestly, there's just not enough time to... We're not allowing people to have, unless you can pay out of pocket, really not allowing people to almost form that kind of dependence. And what I think is there's often a strange paradox is that, if anything, we're taking people who have, so many patients who have so much capacity for more independence and often kind of infantilizing them a bit, making them too dependent. And the truly severely mentally ill, the people who need that kind of benign paternalism, people who are hallucinating in the parks and, dying of frostbite because they're too paranoid to, come into an ER. That's the subpopulation that there are a lot of psychiatrists who are very much advocating for those individuals, no question about it. And there are some changes in HHS putting greater value on that population. But in general, they have not been enough of a focus of the psychiatric profession, the most vulnerable people.
Well, we're adjourning at 3:30, and we've got half an hour for conversation with all of you. Is there a microphone roving, or are we just talking loud? Does anyone know? Looks like we got some folks with some mics. So I want to try initially to see if I can elicit questions or comments from anyone here who's a member of iGen, which would mean born, 1995
or later.
Or after. I see people who look suspiciously like they're part of that generation. We'd like to hear from one or two of you about the extent to which any of this rings true, false, or something else. Anybody? Any volunteers? I see people having an eye debate about who goes first.
It might all be 1994.
Yes, we've got a brave person to your immediate left.
There we go. Hi, thank you for talking today. My name is Nick. I'm actually a student at Claremont McKenna College.
Oh, great.
Oh, wow.
Undergrad?
But so I was wondering, it was touched upon earlier about hate speech, and that's been a very big topic on whether or not bringing certain speakers to campus who promote hate speech or do not promote. At what point can an administration step in if a large majority of people don't want a speaker there, or at what line do people start being deemed hate speech if it's not necessarily just what you hate?
Well, I'm a First Amendment lawyer, so there's a couple different answers to that. One, there's no such thing as hate speech as far as the law is concerned. And this is something that comes as a real shock when I tell this to students when I'm on campus. There is no such exception for hate speech under the First Amendment. It's basically synonymous with protected speech because you basically aren't allowed to engage in viewpoint discrimination. So if we think something is hateful, it's protected. Now there's the more colloquial kind of meaning of hate speech, which I worry about because it is prone to concept creep. Now, I actually think we're thinking about, in some ways, the whole issue of who gets invited to speak on campus wrong. That essentially, and I've watched campuses do this, and I actually do think to some degree it is cynical. Watching not on most administrators, but some administrators have moved the bar from it being, if you're invited to speak on campus, that's kind of almost at least a little bit like endorsing what you say. And that was never, nobody made that mistake when I was in college in the 90s. We even had a little bit of a like, let's invite someone completely crazy here because I want to find out what the crazy theories are, on the Freemasons or on the lizard people or UFOs. we were, and I've always been genuinely fascinated by this. And I think that a better version of education would actually promote some of that. So there was a big debate, for example, around Steve Bannon. Politically, I could not be more on the opposite spectrum than Steve Bannon. And since he declared himself as like the voice of the alt-right, he actually owns that title really well. And you can make an argument that like a lot of people have, that he's an advocate of what would be racialized white nationalist hate speech. And this happened at the New Yorker Festival. And I talked about this on Smerconish, and I got two different kinds of arguments. One was, well, would you want to hear what someone from ISIS had to say? And my answer was, of course I would want to hear what something from ISIS. That would be the most amazing interview I've ever heard in my life with my anthropologist hat on. And then, of course, the next one was saying that, well, but now he's marginal and irrelevant. Now, the first part of that is to say, I'm also interested in kooky theories if they're popular, but we're pretending here. This was the second most powerful person in the White House for a while, and he's currently on a tour of Europe. He's been touring in Europe, advising different nationalist groups on how to deliver their message better. So we're just kind of kidding ourselves. So I feel like in some ways hate speech is almost the wrong question. It's not as if you're endorsing someone by having an interview with them. And in some cases, the things you most badly need to know about your society are the ones that make you the most uncomfortable.
Let's just add, go ahead. Why don't you do it?
You should go first.
Okay. So if you're going to ask administrators to disinvite someone or prevent someone from coming onto campus, there's two things you better do. One is, if you're going to use the concept of hate speech, even though it's not a legal concept, there's at least a common sense meaning that this person is coming onto campus to spout hate. They're going to come here and say how terrible certain groups are. I mean, other than Richard Spencer, I don't know of anybody who does that. Even Milo, he's a performance artist, he's a provocateur. But all right, so you better focus on something about hate. It's hard for me to understand how Christina Hoff Sommers coming to your campus to talk about gender difference is hate speech.
Yeah.
Basically, if they hate her, so it's hate speech. Secondly, you better have your facts straight. And what I've seen in these protests is an absolute commitment to not getting the facts straight.
Yeah.
So here it is, a few months after the election, when everyone's surprised that President Trump is elected. Who should we consult about this? Who would we like to have at Middlebury College? Maybe somebody who's been writing about the white working class and what's been happening to them. Maybe the best possible speaker is Charles Murray. But no, we have to ban him because we hear he wrote a book that we haven't read, but that's not what he's talking about. But we need to use violence to stop him from talking about what he. Right. So there's Alice Dreger calls it fact-free activism or something. There's a commitment to not getting the facts straight. You have to only go on rumor. So once you open that door to saying we're going to protest this, you really want to welcome this way of thinking onto your campus?
And the bar does shift very quickly who becomes beyond the pale. And I've watched it happen. Now they're really trying to move it to Ben Shapiro, and that's just going to go down from there.
Allison, did you want to weigh in?
Yeah, just two quick things. I agree with everything you've said, but I think these things are solved practically quite easily if you say that if a faculty member is involved in an event on campus, it probably means it's worth engaging.
Sure.
Even you totally disagree with the speaker. And the fact that I'm there willing to read the stuff and engage, you need to give me the benefit of the doubt. I think that would apply to your cases as well, right? If there's a faculty member saying this is worth, I'm pointing to whom I assume is Christina Hoff Sommers. Mm. Yeah. That's a really simple rule. I'll just give one example. I was the founding director of the Rohatyn Center for International Affairs at Middlebury College, and I got all kinds of requests for speakers. And my position just completely mirrored yours. You want to bring someone who's really extreme on the right? Okay, great. Well, let's be sure we bring someone extreme on the left sometime down the road. They don't have to speak at the same time, but let's just let 1,000 ideas bloom. And the one thing that gave me pause was this. I'll throw this out to you to think about it. I once got a call from the flak for the Taliban.
Ooh.
They had a flak for the invasion of Afghanistan. Before the invasion of Afghanistan.
Oh, wow.
They wanted this representative to speak at Middlebury College. And I said, well, the Taliban's views are kind of extreme when it comes to women.
Yeah.
And I said, I'm willing to consider having you speak, but you've got to be willing to have a faculty member as a discussant.
Yep.
So you have that back and forth. Well, guess what? The Taliban didn't want it under those circumstances. I think we can apply that same rule to any speaker. If they're not willing to have someone engage them as a discussant, we don't need them on a college campus.
Yep.
Great idea. I'm going to go to, are you iJohn? Yes. One more, please. Thank you.
On behalf of your generation.
On behalf of your generation. Are you committed to a culture of safetyism and wrapped in bubble wrap all the time?
No, I'm not a big fan, let's say that. But so one thing you do mention in your book, though, is the role of media polarization in driving this us versus them mentality. You also talk about corporatization of the university a lot. But one thing, and I think you note it in passing in the book, is that both of these things emerged in response to market forces, in part. So at the risk of triggering every AEI scholar here, I want to ask you, do you think there's a sense in which neoliberalism is responsible for the current crisis that you're documenting?
To the extent that markets bring about almost miraculous outcomes when certain assumptions and parameters are met, we give them the benefit of the doubt, and that certainly is the view at AEI. But there's a long history, going back to the 19th century, of pointing out ways in which free market societies create these paradoxes or will bring about the conditions of their own destruction. And of course, those predictions have always been wrong until now in terms of destruction, but pointing out these unforeseen negative effects, yes, I think the American media environment is an example of that. There was a wonderful book written called Good Work about 10 or 15 years ago. Some psychologists looked at behavior geneticists and journalists. And for the behavior geneticists, they were very happy in their job because doing excellent work is exactly what gets you ahead as a behavior geneticist. And the journalists were all despondent because doing excellent work does not get you ahead in journalism. It's doing the things that get the clicks. And this was 10 or 15 years ago. So I think there are a number of places where free market forces can certainly lead to outcomes that are really, really bad for democracy. I am a pessimist when it comes to the future of our politics and possibly even our country because of these forces, yes.
This raises a question that I wanted to ask earlier at lunch and might be too long to discuss, but maybe you have a quick answer. According to the historian Neil Ferguson, the last infotech disruption of this magnitude was the invention of the printing press, and it led to 100 years of warfare, the deaths of millions, and so on. What are we looking at now?
Trying to keep that from happening.
Given that, so Steve Pinker's written about how the decline of violence has been going on for a long time. So we're not going to have deaths of millions, I don't think. But the printing press was a slow-moving, very slow-moving change. The way I think about it is we've been involved in this thing called the American experiment. How do you create a country that is not based on blood and soil? How do you create a country that is not based on a shared religion? It's very hard. It's very hard to create a multi-ethnic secular democracy. Clearly it can work because we did it in the 20th century. But I personally think that the margin of error is very small. And I think social media has now inflamed the tribal sentiment such that we are no longer within the margin of error. So I think that if things keep going on the way they're going, terrible things are going to happen. On the other hand, we have adapted to everything in our past. It took us 50 years to adapt to junk food. I hear that for the first time last year, the obesity rate stopped rising. It might even have started falling. So eventually we figure out ways to live with things that activate our ancient sentiments. So in 100 years from now, I'm sure things will be better than they are now. But 10, 20 years from now, I don't think so.
Yeah. And kind of combining both questions. In the book, we talk about these as problems of progress. And one of my friends just wrote a book called The Paradox of Progress, about plagues in human history. And I just disagree with the term that it's a paradox. I think progress is necessarily going to generate new problems, usually new unforeseen problems, things that you hadn't actually considered, and they tend to sort of spiral off. And John and I have had this discussion before. I still would prefer to live now than my dad grew up in 1926 in Yugoslavia than almost any other time in human history. John did point out how awesome the 90s were.
The 90s were great.
So maybe the 90s, they were pretty awesome. But that essentially, when it comes to like these new problems that they generate, if anybody would actually try to make the argument with a straight face that being wealthier doesn't create new problems, having more access to food doesn't create new problems, that doesn't even make a great deal of sense. And we talk about problems of progress in the book in terms of the technological resources that we're talking about now that allow us to retreat to these echo chambers are also amazing in many other ways. The access to all of humankind's knowledge in the palm of your hand is really flabbergastingly amazing. But we're noticing these new behaviors that we hadn't had to account for, that it really triggers parts of our tribalist nature. It reinvigorates them, and could actually, just like to every Steve Pinker, you have a Tyler Cowen, that they could actually have the seeds of their own destruction in them. I'm a little bit more optimistic than about the next 10 years, but that might just be sheer terror talking.
Of course, the more pessimistic we are, maybe the more we'll be able to galvanize a reaction. Okay, let's go to non-iGen people. Let's see. How about, we haven't had a female yet, so.
I'm female.
Hi, this has just opened my
Can you just
mind completely because I have
introduce
two
yourself?
children. Oh, I'm sorry. I'm Laurie Kempson from the American Council of Trustees and Alumni. And but this is totally unrelated to where I work. This is being a mother of two kids who were born in the 90s. And I just have to say that I grew up having a lot of freedom as a child, and when we tried to parent our children that way, what we ran into was a brick wall in elementary school. And I was stunned, and I was constantly finding myself fighting against the protectionism in the elementary school, and I'm just wondering what your advice is, or what you think about that, and how do you deal with that?
Great. So the first thing is kill all the lawyers. The second thing,
Does that mean can I make it?
Yeah, because you're a recovery. Yeah. The second thing is go to letgrow.org, a wonderful organization started by Lenore Skenazy, who wrote the book Free Range Kids. I'm on the board of that. And because once Greg and I worked out how bad all this is, what the bad effect is having on kids, and then Daniel Schuchman, the chair of the board of FIRE, where Greg works, came to me to ask how he was concerned that these attitudes on college are actually starting earlier, in high school and earlier. So I went to talk to Lenore Skenazy to see if she wanted to do a lot more than she's been doing, and she agreed. So go to letgrow.org. Just for example, a simple thing. You get the school to leave the playground open an hour early and leave it open from 3 to 5. Why do kids have to have activities 5 days a week? My kids would much rather, especially from the age of 8 to 11, they'd much rather hang out with their friends on the playground. It's totally safe. Yep. Just make sure there's not an adult supervising. The adult can be right inside, but the adult can't be there to resolve disputes. Yep. Now, if someone gets hurt, of course. But so simple things like that. Go talk to the police chief and get a few parents to say, we'd like to let our kids go to the park. Are you going to bust us, or is that? And give him a copy of the Coddling the American Mind before you go. No, but seriously, if anybody here who has kids in elementary or junior or anything K to 12, give a copy of our book to the principal or the teachers, because what you'll find is that most people are concerned about this stuff, and it's a social coordination problem. An individual can't do much on their own, as you found out. But if a group go to the leadership, and the leadership already is thinking this is a problem, then everyone says, oh, wow, you're thinking this too? Great, let's do this simple thing. Yeah. So there's a lot we can do.
And I did want to tag on to that, because I think about this a lot, because I have two kids under 3, and they're going to be going to public school right by my house and all this kind of stuff. And I think that raising kids in like whatever part of the 90s you raised them, I think that there hadn't been enough evidence that there was any downsides to obsessing more and more over safety. And I think that. Right. Yeah. Oh, safety and fear and concentration. Interesting. Okay, that wasn't so much what I was thinking. I was thinking that essentially there was no pushback, because essentially the pushback of like it makes kids stronger was treated like a silly stereotype of grumpy old men. But actually now, at least in my neighborhood, and we live right on Capitol Hill, what we talk about with other parents, it is a growing awareness that actually, oh my God, this really did come with some serious downsides. And unfortunately, I think it took there being enough stories, enough evidence of there being a downside before it can actually start to repair itself.
Sir, up in front, Mr. Golovin.
Hi, Carl Golovin, retired special agent, U.S. Customs. I was a 9/11 responder. Domain reference NIDEA.liveson.net. And I won't go down the path of my not believing the official conclusions about 9/11, but I helped go through a third tower, number 7, that collapsed that day, which tends to undermine the official story. But I think 9/11, which I would say is false flag terrorism, of course, instilled fear that causes people to look to hierarchical power for protection. But simultaneously about that time in 2002, the Boston Globe broke their Spotlight story. There's a true movie about the extent to which 6% globally of Roman Catholic priests were found to be serial pedophiles.
Is there a question, though?
Well, I'm laying a foundation. And part of it is that...
We've got so many people. We need you to get to a question.
Well, we're trained to worship hierarchical power, whether it be corporate, church, or government, and to always go to that power to tell us what's true, even in every place in
is
DC.
there a question, please?
Yes. Have we been learned to be obedient to hierarchical power to the extent that we don't simply live, have faith in Christ, and...
Clearly not at Middlebury.
Yeah, I don't think so. I don't see any evidence of that.
Is there a difference between apologizing and asking someone to forgive you? It's a huge distinction.
Don't know. I mean, we read about the book in Moral Dependency that essentially there is a problem with always looking to power to solve your problems, and that's.
But it's not because you respect them; it's because you want them to serve you.
Right.
It looks like that, Arnold. See you back there.
Arnold Kling. So I've heard today, and I can think in my mind, lots of examples of safetyism coming from young people on the left. Are there comparable examples of people being disinvited from conservative campuses or something, or just some balance there?
So there's a very important paper in 2014 by Manning and Campbell, 2 sociologists, where they analyze victimhood culture. They talk about what happens when you have a situation of very, very high egalitarianism and you have authorities that can be brought in to punish. Basically, they describe a college campus. And they describe the ideology of victimhood and the status of victimhood. And they say, this is something which is growing on the left, but they say in 2014, but if this language is out there among young people, soon we're going to start seeing it on the right. And we do occasionally see it on the right. So you do sometimes. Conservative students have rarely done, I don't know of any shout-downs. I don't think they've ever done a shout-down.
It's hard for me to take one.
In the fire data, I don't think there are any from the right that are shout-downs. But you do begin to see the language of victimhood. Basically, nowadays, everybody can believe they're a victim. Everybody can. Google is being sued by white men on the, who say that the conservatives are discriminated against, and by women and minorities. Everybody can feel they're a victim now. Everybody can point to evidence, and certainly evidence is given to them. So we have a culture of rampant victimhood, and we are beginning to see, I think, some cases of people on the right using it too.
You saw Lindsey Graham at the hearing on Thursday.
But much of that's victimhood. That was a moral charge.
You're trying to shut me up, and you're trying to shut people like me up.
Right. That's the language of censorship. Right. We're all being censored.
Yeah. Sir. Hi, Jen.
No, unfortunately. I'm right on the level, 1992. So my question has to do with
Could you introduce yourself?
I am Dennis. I am from Johns Hopkins SAIS, from right down the street. So my question is, earlier it was mentioned that if you were from the Philippines, you would go out at 6, and then when you came here, it was 12. I'm wondering if socioeconomic class or if the rural-urban divide plays any substantial role in the coddling of the American mind.
Yeah. It does. We did some research on that. There are 2 wonderful books, one by Robert Putnam called Our Kids, and one by Annette Leroux called, what's the title of the book again, Annette Leroux? Unequal Childhoods, I think it was. And they both came to the same conclusion, which is the divide is between middle class and above versus working class and below. Working class and poor use what they called, but the wealthier people use concerted cultivation, where you're bringing them to activity to build their mind, to get them into college. And the lower class uses what's called natural growth parenting. They have the idea that leave kids alone, they're going to grow up. We don't have to guide them through growing up. On the other hand, working class people have much more unstable family lives, more crime in their environments. So the problems on college campuses for people from the upper middle class, the psychological disorders there are very different in origin from the relatively small number of people from the working class. At elite colleges, there's very few people from working class. But they have a very different set of disorders exposed to much more toxic stress and more trauma in childhood. So there are big class differences. Turns out in those two books, they both say the race differences are small compared to the class differences. And this, I think, is a major point. America is being torn apart on for many reasons. I think social class is the most important one we should be looking at. It's the one that almost everybody agrees it's fair to give extra help to people from working class backgrounds. So I think we do need to pay more attention than we're paying to social class.
Yeah, and we do have a section in the book that's all about the difference in parenting for different classes.
Over here on my right. Thank you, Sal.
Hi, thank you for this panel.
Hi, Jen.
Yes, 95.
Name affiliation?
My name is Claudia. I'm now at the Arab American Institute, graduated from Pomona just the past year. Hi, Nick. Quick response to a question you raised earlier about admissions processes and identity. So in my experience, and at Pomona, I think a lot of small liberal arts colleges try to do the same, is picking students based on kind of their expressions of curiosity, intellectual curiosity, and a self-awareness of their kind of position, whether about their position in a nexus of diverse experiences and points of view. And I think that's kind of a different way of thinking about identity that actually sees it as colleges trying to cultivate that experience of questioning different points of view and engaging with others. So kind of, I just wanted to respond to that. But then my question is this. Now, more recently, we've seen Kenneth Marcus, Department of Education, kind of bring about this more expansive view of anti-Semitism in the Rutgers case. Can you respond to that?
Sure. This is more as the president of FIRE. We're trying to sort of put the genie back in the bottle to a degree on defining anti-discrimination law. We have a whole chapter on it actually about we call it the bureaucratization of safetyism, bureaucracy of safetyism, where we talk about how sort of like the corporate structure of universities actually make a lot of these problems worse. And one feedback loop is Department of Education regulations. Sometimes are enforced in genuinely absurd ways and absolutely manifestly unconstitutional ways. And what we've seen recently with Ken is the revival of a case from 2012, was it? 2011? It's an old case at Rutgers in which a student had been saying something about Zionism, and it was, they weren't particularly nasty, but they're very much directed at Israel. And again, it's a 6-year-old case. So we're on record saying that we don't want this expanding from any direction, and we do want to put the genie back in the bottle, which is why what we recommend is what we call the Davis standard, which is essentially it's drawn from a 2000 Supreme Court opinion that makes it clear that harassment is not intended to just be anytime someone's offended. It couldn't be anyway under the First Amendment. It has to be a severe, pervasive, and persistent pattern of behavior. So it's not just it's an exception to speech. It's considered not speech.
So criticizing Zionism should be okay.
Yeah.
We have time for one more. Before we get to it, our book's on sale. I'd urge everybody to acquire this magnificent book. It really is important, and it's superbly written. Let's go to Ryan, who's been so patient here for the last question.
Thank you so much, guys. My name's Ryan. I'm a PhD student at American University. Oh, thank you very much. But my question was for you is, my mom has been an elementary school teacher for the last 30 years. And the one thing she has noticed is, along with what you said, recess has been taken away by the administration, which is, I think, is crazy.
It's insane.
But the other thing she's noticed has been the high diagnosis of young kids. She's a first grade teacher with ADHD and other disorders similar to that. And this is something she hadn't seen in her entire first decade of teaching. And now it's very prevalent across all of her classes. And I was wondering what role that might be playing in this discussion.
I'm going to kick that over to Sally, because that's one that people have asked me about. We looked into a little bit. We didn't really find a clear link. So the fact that when did Ritalin and other drugs, when were they heavily prescribed? And do we think this might in any way make students more fragile, more vulnerable?
Well, I think it's been going on for well over a decade. And probably a number of these kids probably don't need it to the extent that what they're reacting to is some sort of chaos at home. Some kids do, and it really changes their life and improves their prospects tremendously. But in the kids who don't need it, I think the main problem is that it sends the signal if there's a problem, you go to a drug. And some of the tentacles of that have probably reached forward into some of the drug problems we have now, and kids who are in their teens and early 20s. But it really comes down again to and also the fact that there are benefits and entitlements that come along with that kind of label, and it's a shame that there aren't other mechanisms for kids who have some sort of learning disability or what probably is the problem to get the kinds of help they need. So there are problems with the apparatus of kids who really are suffering, getting the better help they need, and all that. But from a larger cultural standpoint, I'd say that their medications are warranted for some kids, but in general, there's a larger message, which is, if not turn to the adult, turn to the medication.
Thank you all for coming. Are our authors standing to sign? Yeah. You can get your book signed.
Yeah, we'll be.
Thank you all very much. Thank you all for coming.
Thank you, everyone.